join me in welcoming Dave Jourdan, tonight's keynote speaker.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Jim, for that award, which I accept in honor of the veterans of the battle that are here tonight, which is really why we're all here, and it's been a pleasure to have a chance to have my picture taken with them and to speak for a few minutes with those folks that are here tonight. So I'd like to take you back to June 4th, 1942, 10:20 a.m. The mobile force of the First Air Fleet of the Japanese Navy, the same force that hammered Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier, is approaching Midway. Midway sits in the middle of the Pacific and is the next outpost before Pearl Harbor. They had already attacked the island with a devastating bomber attack with the objective of invading and occupying the island. All morning, the U.S. Navy had been fighting back. Navy and Marine Corps, I should say, because the first group to attack were the aircraft from Midway Island itself. 67 planes had been launched against the Japanese. None of them had any success, although there were many brave attempts. Thanks to our intelligence, which is a significant, important part of this story, Admiral Fletcher, who commanded our naval fleet of 3 aircraft carriers, the Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet, was poised to the northwest of Midway to surprise the Japanese, who themselves thought they had the element of surprise. All morning, Admiral Fletcher had been sending his forces to attack the Japanese. He had sent 151 attack aircraft to attempt to deflect this force. By 10:20 a.m., all but 13 of those aircraft had either attacked, expended their weapons to no effect, or had been shot down, or were lost. Those 13 planes were attacking one of the 4 Japanese carriers that were approaching Midway. Regardless of the outcome of that attack, which was led by an officer by the name of Leslie, whether they sunk that carrier or not, the other 3 carriers were ready to counterattack the American fleet. And Admiral Nagumo, who was in charge of that fleet, knew where the Americans were. We talk about a force being decimated, and we say that, I think, lightly quite often. The torpedo squadrons that made that attack that morning were literally decimated. 40 of 43 were lost. Fewer than 1 in 10 returned. Now, I'd like to leave us at this dramatic moment for a bit. And most of you, I'm sure, in this audience are very familiar with the background of the Battle of Midway, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to delve into it very much, but as you probably know, the Japanese, by that 6 months after Pearl Harbor, were in control of pretty much the whole Western Pacific, Malaysia, the Philippines. Hong Kong had been attacked. Darwin had even been struck with great loss of life. And they were pretty much on the move and had accomplished most of the goals of the reasons for getting into the war to begin with. And so the next stop was Midway Island, and they were bound to attack and take that. The ships that were making the attack were the same ones that attacked Pearl Harbor, except for 2 of them. The 4 on the left, the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, were making the attack. The other 2, Shokaku and Zuikaku, had been damaged at the previous Battle of Coral Sea and were not in the attack. I think this is a pretty interesting photo. You never would have seen these ships all lined up like this. This is a miniature model. I've seen another photo where a quarter is laid across the decks of 2 of these ships. They're incredible. Here's a photo, vintage photo of the Kaga from 1928, huge ship. And another photo of the Kaga before it had a flight deck extended over the bow. And this is a cool picture of a Akagi taken from the tail of one of the aircraft that had just launched from it. That was the flagship. And the Hiryu and Soryu looked like this. This is the Hiryu. They were very similar. Now, they had 264 aircraft attacking Midway, and they were hoping to find the Japanese, or the American fleet as well. Now, besides the American aircraft carriers, we had another line of defense out there, and that was the submarines. Now, here's where I'm going to take my prerogative as a former submariner to focus a little bit on that aspect of the battle, which I think has largely not been highlighted. The Americans had a cordon, an arc of submarines in an effort to try to detect the Japanese fleet as it approached. They didn't know exactly when and from what direction they would approach, and to try to slow them down, and also to warn of their approach. And the Nautilus was one of these. This is the Nautilus. This is not the nuclear-powered Nautilus that was built after the war, but this is the vintage 1930 ship that was built before the treaties after World War I limited the size of submarines. So this was a huge ship, 4,000 tons, 351 or 371 feet long. And it carried 5-inch cannon, which is very large for a submarine, the size you would have on cruisers. This shot is actually taken just before the Battle of Midway in December of 42. I'm sorry, after the Battle of Midway in December of 42, but in that time frame. We don't have a nice photo like this of Nautilus, but here's the Narwhal, its sister ship, so it gives you an idea of its size and the layout. Now, if you haven't been on a submarine, you probably might think that a 4,000-ton, 370-foot ship was large, and it was. But on the inside, it was mostly crammed with equipment, engines, batteries, stores, weapons, and very little space left for the actual people. I did a little line drawing and highlighted the actual living and working space of this ship, and that's highlighted in yellow there. It works out to about the size or the acreage of a 4-bedroom house that 93 men lived and worked in for as many weeks at a time. The little red area above that is the conning tower. Now, in World War II submarines, because they were relatively small hulls, in order to get the periscope as high as possible, they had an attack center built in a small compartment above the main hull, that when the periscope was raised to that level, you could see farther. And that was called the conning tower. In this case, it was an 18-foot long by 8-foot diameter cylinder that was crammed with 2 periscopes, radar, radios, sonars, attack computer, and other gear that typically 10 men would be in and operate in during battle stations. Now, during the Battle of Midway, the chief sonarman, a fellow by the name of Wetmore, had dysentery, and that involved frequent visits to the head. And the captain did not want the sonar station unmanned for a moment. So he had the next sonarman in line, a fellow named Buzz Lee, also up there in the conning tower, sitting on a folding chair. So there were actually 11 men in that little space the day of the battle. Now, the Nautilus was commanded by Bill Brockman, and William Brockman was an exception early in the war in that he was a very aggressive commanding officer. And one example is the submarines were told that at approximately 7 a.m. they were to guard or listen to the search aircraft, PBY aircraft, radio net, because this was unencrypted and they could hear what was going on. Brockman said, well, that's not good enough. He was never one to be constrained by his orders. So he said, I know those aircraft are up in the air at 4:30 a.m. because that's dawn, that time and place, and I'm going to put my antenna up at 5 a.m. and hear what they're talking about. And he was the first to hear the report of many planes approaching Midway and had an idea that the fleet was approaching him for what direction. It happened to be coming right through his sector, but he was able to put himself in position to attack the fleet. And he discovered he was approaching the fleet by being depth charged and attacked by aircraft. And nonetheless, he put up his periscope and he pressed on his attack. And I'm going to read to you, one of the advantages of the Nautilus was they kept very good logs, and there was an excellent diary written. We were able to read all this information and try to reconstruct what happened. And I'm going to read to you one of the passages that Brockman wrote in his log at this time. He said, "The picture presented on raising the periscope was one never experienced in peacetime practices. Ships were on all sides, moving across the field at high speed and circling away to avoid the submarine's position. Ranges were above 3,000 yards. The Jinsu-class cruiser had passed over and was now astern. The battleship was on our port bow and firing her whole starboard broadside battery at the periscope. Flag hoists were being made, searchlights were trained at the periscope. The exact position of Nautilus may have been known by the enemy at this time because number 9 deck torpedo was running hot in the tube as a result of shearing the torpedo retaining pin during depth charging." So it was a busy morning. The Nautilus pressed its attack, fired torpedoes at the battleship, was rewarded with more depth charges, and at one point, the Arashi, which was actually the cruiser that he referred to, was a destroyer that was attacking him. And this is a picture of the Arashi. The most dangerous weapon against a submarine were depth charges, and the destroyers and cruisers possessed them in quantity. At one point, this ship was approaching directly at Nautilus, and Brockman put his periscope up and saw it coming straight at him. His best defense in that case was to fire a torpedo, not expecting it to hit because he didn't have time to line it up and it was coming straight at him anyway, but it would at least deflect the attack possibly. Now, the only safety he had from depth charging was in depth, to go deeper. And I'm sure that the periscope assistant assumed that after he launched that torpedo, he would immediately dive deep. But no, Brockman set up periscope. He wanted to look and see what effect his shot had on the destroyer before he planned his next move, which I think was a very cool move. So, the Nautilus experienced 42 depth charges over the course of this battle. And let me tell you that this was their first war patrol. None of the men in the Nautilus had ever been to war before, including Brockman. I was interested in trying to understand what this might have been like. And I know we have at least one man in the room who's experienced it. And I was able to speak with Buzz Lee about his experiences. But I found a couple of interesting bits of information in my research. There's a website called the Historic Navy Ships Association, and on it they have a really interesting site called Sounds of the Sea. And among many interesting underwater sounds is sounds recorded inside a submarine hull of depth charges exploding at different distances away. And one of the things that is characteristic of this, when a depth charge explodes, it creates a bubble of gas and 1 million pounds of pressure in that little bubble. This creates a shock wave, which if you're a physics major, you'll know that means that the water was moved so fast that it moves the next bit of water, and this shock wave propagates with a lot of energy away from that explosion, faster than the speed of sound. When that hit the ship, you would hear a click or a ping, like a hammer blow on the hull, and you would feel it. The next thing that would happen is the actual deafening blast would reach you, moving at the speed of sound. And quite often then that bubble would collapse and rebound, and you'd have multiple reverberations. This situation was described in the logs, and we also had an interesting report that was done of the physiology of this experience. Obviously, when this happens, you're having pressure spiking. 130 pounds per square inch were measured, and your inside shake. And men reported even seeing luminous jets flying across the compartments. And what was concluded was that this was actually motion of the fluid in the retina causing you to see these lights. So it had to be an awful, awful experience. Buzz Lee talked about it. And of course, as I said, one of the measures was depth. If you could get deep enough, you could get below the depth they were exploding, because Japanese depth charges were set to explode at 50 or 100 feet at that time of the war. If you went to 300 feet or even deeper, you might be able to get away. Buzz said, We didn't give a damn how deep we went. I thought I was going to die. I thought it was the end. He said there was nothing to be done, there was nowhere to turn, there was no way to help a shipmate through the ordeal, and you did not want to see the fear in another man's eyes. You just looked at your shoes. He said you just held on and sat there. What are you going to do? You're helpless. So for all 42 depth charges, they had to wade it through and hope they could make it. Now, 52 American submarines were lost during World War II, 50 of them in the Pacific, with more than 3,500 crew. I like to point out that with 2% of the Navy, the submarines sunk 58% of Japanese shipping. But it was at a great cost. 3,500 crew were lost, 1 in 5 of those who served. That was the highest rate of attrition of any service in World War II. 22 submarines were lost by depth charging. Now, at that time of the war, as I said, the depth charges were set to explode at a fairly shallow depth. Congressman Andrew May, who was on a war fact-finding tour, discovered this interesting fact, and I think he thought it would be cool to tell his constituents. So he held a press conference. And of course, the logical outcome was that after a month or so, the Japanese had changed their depth charges to explode deeper. And it's believed that some 10 ships with maybe 800 American lives were lost because of Andrew May's disclosure. And you'll be sorry to hear that he was not prosecuted for this breach of security, but he did go to federal prison for war profiteering. Now, going back to where I left you at 10:20 a.m., as I said, there were 13 aircraft commanded by Max Leslie that were attacking from the east one of the Japanese carriers, the Soryu. But there was another force of aircraft of that 151 that was lost, but they weren't out of action, commanded by Wade McCluskey. He had 33 Dauntless dive bombers that had flown to the south of the fleet, turned left or turned right, gone past, and missed them, and were heading northwest, and we're probably not going to find them. But then he saw something. He saw a Japanese destroyer, the Arashi. The Arashi had been left to finish off Nautilus, and at some point it was called back to the fleet, and it headed in a beeline for the fleet. McCluskey saw it, and he said, let's follow it, and he lined up his planes, and all 33 of them shortly were rewarded with masts on the horizon. Now, I don't believe that, as some people have said, that the Battle of Midway was a lucky event for the Americans. I believe it was more a case of relentless, brave attacks by American airmen and submariners on the fleet that caused the Japanese to be out of balance and without time to retaliate. In this particular case, there was a bit of luck. It turns out that McCluskey's 33 dive bombers arrived because of their circuitous route from exactly the opposite direction that Leslie's group was. And they so they targeted 2 other ships, and they happened to arrive within the minute of each other. So you all of a sudden had an unplanned, totally coordinated attack from different directions on 3 of the 4 aircraft carriers. And as history says, they were mortally hit and proceeded over the course of the next few hours to burn and sink. There was a 4th one sunk the next day, and at the expense of the USS Yorktown and the Hammond that was mentioned earlier. Now, this is a classic photo of one of the Dauntlesses. It's actually attacking one of the cruisers the next day. And we don't have any photos of the damage done to the aircraft carriers, but we do have a photo of the cruiser Makuma, so it gives you an idea of what kind of damage these aircraft could do. Now, fast forward to 1999, and we set sail with the Naval Oceanographic Office to try to find wreckage from one of these ships. And we sailed on this ship, the Sumner. I know it's a little rusty, but it was a good ship. Here's a vintage photo of Midway at the time of the battle. And here is a famous photo showing the destruction on the island during the Japanese bombing attack, and I point out the birds that nested on the island in spite of the war. Those birds were still there in 1999. There's some 800,000 nesting pairs of birds that call Midway home. And they had apparently mostly left by the time we were there, but it was still pretty thick. Now, I'm not going to take the time tonight to go into the details of our expedition, but let me just explain that by reconstructing the Nautilus's patrol and exactly where it was, when it saw Kaga, see, Bill Brockman continued to press his attack, and he actually torpedoed the aircraft carrier as it was burning. And by knowing where he was when he fired those torpedoes and his observations, we knew where to search for the ship. So we used a deep-towed sonar device. The bottom here is around 18,000 feet deep. So we needed something that could handle the pressure, and also using sound, make a map of the bottom, and also with cameras and lights be able to photograph what we saw. And sure enough, we found wreckage from one of the carriers. This is one of the more important pieces of the ship because it held some of the anti-aircraft guns on the side, and it also had a landing array on it, which was unique to Kaga, so we knew we had found which ship we had found. The bottom was littered with debris. There's a bell, not the ship's bell, it's too small for that, but maybe from a launch. Lots of wreckage. And I kind of like this photo because it shows a few different things. First of all, the scattering of black blobs on there are golf ball to softball size nodules of almost pure manganese. So this is a common feature of some of the deep sea where you have these resources laying there for the scooping up. Up in the upper right is a deep sea worm trail, so you can see that even at a couple miles or more down, you still have signs of life. And then there's the Japanese sailor's boot, which is commemorates the battle that happened there. Now, we've been trying to go back and explore this site again, but it's kind of remote, it's kind of deep, and it's kind of expensive. But fortunately, I want to very briefly give credit to our friends at NOAA who invited us to join them earlier this year as they were mapping the marine sanctuary that we were talking about earlier. And they promised to give us 2 days to further explore targets at the Battle of Midway site, which is just up on the upper left corner. So we told them where to search, and we worked up a great plan. And this is the ship that was out there, the Okeanos Explorer. Now, any of you can go on their website when they're operating and get a live view of what they're doing, because that big ball on the top is a gibbled satellite dish that allows them to broadcast, multicast, full bandwidth, high definition video from the seafloor. And we were able to actually be in communication by teleconference with the scientists on the ship and watching in real time the scenes from the deep sea. And they found some amazing stuff. These images came from anywhere from 2,000 to 4,000 meters deep. And it gives you an idea of the abundance of life in the deep sea that we really have not had a chance to really explore. This is one of the more famous shots from that expedition. This guy was on the news, and I was really proud to be watching it live when it was discovered. This is at about 13,000 feet deep. I'm told it's the deepest that they've ever found this kind of critter, and this is an unknown species of octopus. So it was quite a wonderful expedition. Unfortunately, out in the ocean you have something called weather, and we were interested in the spot right about there, and you can see what was swirling around us, and unfortunately the weather precluded us from getting any dives in on Midway this time. But we certainly spun up a lot of people and got a lot of interest in going back, and I hope we'll get a chance to do it again next year. Now, before I close, I want to say a few things about some of the heroes of Nautilus, one of which we have here tonight. Bill Brockman, I've already talked about. He was the captain. He was a very grizzled 36-year-old there. He is receiving the Navy Cross for heroism at the Battle of Midway. Now, many of you know that the Navy Cross is the highest honor that the Navy can award, second only to the Medal of Honor, which the Navy can't award. Brockman won 3 of these, and he actually retired as an admiral. He was a great leader, and I know that for a number of reasons. Number one, all of his wardroom of 7 officers, 6 of them became submarine commanders. The only one that didn't was killed in action before he had a chance. His chief of the boat, Red Porterfield, was also eventually commissioned and became a submarine commander. He also, of his group of 7 officers, 3 became admiral, which is a pretty high percentage. I was lucky to have the testimony of Buzz Lee and Red Porterfield and other crew members, and they told about Brockman's leadership and his success. Now, Brockman he retired after the war, and he went back to his native Baltimore, and he became a successful chemical company executive, and he even did a little promotion. He was featured by Camel Cigarettes for, yeah, you've got the model of the Nautilus there, and thought that was an interesting outcome. Now, a few of the other officers I want to make mention of. This fellow, Pat Rooney, was the first lieutenant, and he commanded the Corvina, and that ship has the unhappy distinction of being the only submarine that was sunk by a Japanese submarine during the war. And it was on Pat's first patrol. So he went down with the Corvina in that just a year or so later. This was a really interesting guy, Ozzie Lynch. Ozzie was a camera enthusiast. He had a still camera and a 16 millimeter film camera. And he brought them with him on board, and he figured out how to attach them to the periscope and actually took shots through the periscope, and including this one, which is a famous photo of the destroyer Yamakaze that the Nautilus sank in the continuation of the Midway patrol. They came in for repairs and went right back out, and they sank the ship, and Ozzie got this shot, which appeared in Life magazine as the photo of the year. It's been seen a lot. It's not always attributed to the Nautilus and Ozzie Lynch, but that's who took it. Now, Ozzie also took film, as I said, and there's some incredible film that we've seen of torpedo firings at targets, the men exercising on deck, VGA Day in Honolulu, and his daughter, Peggy Hegler, had sent me, back when we were researching this project, 3 videotapes with these films, which I was thrilled to have. And when I finally got around to writing the book, I said, well, I'm going to review these films. But I thought I should digitize them first, because they're on VHS tape and they're going to deteriorate. So I did that. And I called Peggy and I said, I've done this and I'd like to offer the DVDs to you, but if you're willing to share that original film, I think we can do a better job today of digitizing it than was done back then. She said, I'm sorry, I can't. She lives in New Orleans. She said they were all destroyed in Katrina. So I may have had the only copy at that point. So I quickly made copies and sent them to her and her sisters. There are snippets of these on YouTube that got out before. Ozzie Lynch actually made admiral, and he was commanding the carrier that recovered the first Apollo capsule. And he died of a heart attack at 53 while on active duty. Another fellow I want to mention in a few minutes I have left is this fellow, the junior officer on board, Ensign DeFries. He was the son of an admiral. Admiral DeFries served in World War I and was still active but aging at the beginning of World War II. And he was an up-and-coming, promising officer. He was Naval Academy class of 42. So in June of 42, where should he have been? He should have been at graduation ceremonies. But as I'm sure some of you know, they graduated that class a year early. So instead of being at the yard throwing his hat up, he was in the middle of the Battle of Midway. By then, he had already become an accomplished officer. He was standing deck watches and was an integral part of the attack team. He was promoted to lieutenant and transferred to the Sculpin the following year. Now, the Sculpin is another sad story. It was part of a 3-submarine wolf pack attacking a Japanese convoy when it was counterattacked by Japanese destroyers and damaged so badly that they were forced to the surface. The captain ordered his bridge team and gunners to the deck to try to do what they could do to fend off this Japanese ship, which severely outgunned them on the surface. And as soon as they all got topside, the Japanese scored a direct hit on the conning tower and killed everybody, including 23-year-old Raleigh DeFries. So he was one of the 2 of the 7 officers that were killed in action, which is pretty much in keeping with the percentages of submariners that lost their lives in World War II. Now, a couple of other points. I think it's a little poignant to know that the Sculpin was christened by Admiral DeFries' wife, Joe DeFries' mother. There's another bit to this story. On board the Sculpin was a fellow named Joe Cromwell, who was a squadron commander, and he was commanding the Wolfpack. And when the ship was at this point unable to fight back and they were forced to surrender, there were 42 men that were able to get off and be captured by the Japanese. Now, John Cromwell knew a couple of secrets. He knew of the invasion of Tarawa that was upcoming, and he knew of the best-kept secret of the war, which was the cryptological code-breaking secret. And he feared that if he were captured, he would be tortured and reveal some of this information. So he chose to go down with the ship. Now, the 42 that survived for the time being, of those, 21 actually made it through the war, prisoner of war camp, and made it back home in the end. And they told the story of John Cromwell, who was awarded posthumously the Medal of Honor. The last fellow I'll mention was Buzz Lee, who was wonderful in sharing his experiences with us over many hours of telephone conversation. He's, of course, passed away now, but he shared his stories, and they were wonderful. I've included a number of vignettes from his experiences in the book. And here's a vintage photo of Buzz being congratulated by Admiral Nimitz on the occasion of the award of the Munich Commendation for the Nautilus as a result of their action at the Battle of Midway. So there's a submarine story about Midway which you may not expect from a typical Midway Commemoration dinner. And I thank you very much for your time and for the honor of being here with the veterans tonight. And I hope you've enjoyed the story. Thank you very much.